Hi, Founder fans. Jason here, and today we're discussing the Battle of Bunker Hill, and we're going to focus on the last day of Dr. Joseph Warren, spoiler alert, and to help us talk about Dr. Warren, who better than Spencer Van Herik to rejoin us, the Dr. Joseph Warren portrayer himself. Spencer, thank you for coming back.
Hey, thanks for having me back.
Absolutely my pleasure. So, Bunker Hill. Most people who have signed on to this particular YouTube video will know about Bunker Hill, but we're going to dispel some myths, talk a little more specifically about Warren and some of his friends on that day. So let's set us up. First of all, June 17th, 1775. What was going on in Boston, let's say the 15th and 16th of 1775, just as the things start getting heated?
Right before the big climax on the 17th, it's actually today, I believe, on the 15th, that it's resolved by the provincial congress and the council of war with Warren, that the height of Charlestown, called Bunker Hill, needs to be obtained. Several of the hills were always discussed right after following Lexington and Concord. Dorchester Heights, Winter Hill, which is, I believe, right by one of the Adams's, Abigail Adams' residence. I believe that's where she actually viewed the battle from on the 17th. But basically, every single positional hill was in discussion as soon as Lexington and Concord happened, and the colonists take over the countryside, and the British army is basically secluded to just the town of Boston and that peninsula. So this was a big decision, and whether uh, they found out that the British were going to take Charlestown right away, I think is still kind of unknown. But by this point, they have now more warships in the harbor. There's probably, I think, there believe three or four of them right outside of Boston and in Charlestown. And Charlestown is subsequently a much easier hill, not only because of its close proximity to Boston, just across the Charles River, but also it's another peninsula. You can cut off troops at, if you take that peninsula, you basically gain control. So that, I think, also because Charlestown was a little bit more of a lower to middle income class community and not so built up. The buildup of Charlestown happened in the years after the Revolutionary War and what it looks like today. But this is a fairly working class community in Charlestown. So I think in a letter, in back in 1774, they say, we are willing to give our lives if needed, even though we don't have the skill or the men, to make up a fighting force. But we will do what we can, basically. So they are very much committed to this too. But it's a busy couple of days. So they decide on the 15th, we are going to take Bunker Hill. Once they start organizing now these different troops from Connecticut and New Hampshire and Rhode Island and Massachusetts, now who is going to take what position? So on the 16th, Warren is actually busy pretty much all day swearing in brand new captains and colonels. A lot of these men don't perform up to par the following day. We will get into that. Unfortunately, but the majority of the forces that we see on that following day are under uh, Colonel John Stark from New Hampshire. Then we have Israel Putnam, who is with the Connecticut troops, and the majority is then Massachusetts under Colonel Prescott. So 16th is a busy day, and then after this whole busy day of trying to organize your army for a potential battle in 1 or 2 days, Warren has to go right off to Watertown from Cambridge and go be the president of Massachusetts. And there were a lot of business dealings that I guess went on into the night and into the very early hours in the morning. And he basically stayed there all night, until he, I guess, decided to take a nap finally. I always joke that I don't ever know when Warren slept. And I guess I was actually told that columnist schedule was more of on like a nap basis, kind of, 3 hours, 4 hours here, maximizing the day. So that would have been very typical of his lifestyle. But I always joke that I don't know if he
Yeah.
actually slept.
Well, I don't want to get too off topic, but I understand that a huge percentage of human history, people have slept twice. Like you'd go to sleep, wake up in the middle of the night for a while, and then go back to sleep. Which I know sounds crazy, but apparently that's how the human body was supposed to function. But this isn't a science channel. So
No.
anyway, let's talk a little bit about the strategic importance of. So we call it Bunker Hill. The we'll get into it. But the heart of the battle is Breed. So although I understand they did attempt to take both, um,
Well, so yes, I knew you were going to say that, Jason. We've been joking about that the last couple of times. So yes, and that's always the big running joke now is we get into the night of the 16th. Warren's in Watertown. Meanwhile, in Charlestown, the colonists have control of Charlestown and that peninsula because they're able to build a huge earthen fort overnight, and that is engineered by Colonel Richard Gridley, overseen by Colonel William Prescott. The vote is on Bunker Hill. Now, what the problem with Bunker Hill, and this was Warren and both Elbridge Gerry's argument, and both being Bostonians and Massachusetts men, they basically said, listen, uh, Bunker Hill is not so good because one, we're looking at 3, 4 warships that could potentially engage us and have the tide and actually do damage with their artillery. If that happens, and might also be potentially cut off from getting off of Charlestown back to Cambridge. So actually, and that was a huge concern for Artemus Ward, and that's why he actually kept about 1,000 men in Cambridge on the day of Bunker Hill. It's very, we can argue one way or the other if these troops would have made the difference or not in that day. And if we even see the British continue to assault the hill if these extra 1,000 men are there. But this was a huge deal because if they lose Cambridge as well, they lose their sight of the entire Army's camp. And also the site of a lot of government happenings outside of Watertown with Warren and the Council of War and these other colonies, members that are now meeting in Cambridge and staying there. So yes, the running joke is it's on the wrong hill. Why did they do this? We look at strategy, and the other argument was that Breed's Hill was actually much more on an incline than Bunker Hill, and the roads leading out of Charlestown actually wrapped around Bunker Hill to the point where it could have been very easy access for British troops to actually march their way up to any fortification that the colonists would have made. Whereas if Breed's Hill, they have to beach themselves from the ships, climb steep grass about 120 feet, I think. It's a huge incline. And if you walk up Monument Avenue today, you get the picture of how hard it was because it's still a very steep hill up to the Bunker Hill Monument. So at some point, I guess, during the night, they decide that Breed's Hill is the better positioning. And lo and behold, everyone wakes up to be surprised that the Americans have fortified Breed's Hill and are directly facing the warships. So it's apparently they did this not only to better position themselves, but also kind of scare off the British Army. Both sides at this point are kind of operating outside of the direction of King George. And his final decision, and if the Americans are actually seditious rebels, if they should be, tried for treason and captured and executed. We have the same thing happens in Lexington and Concord. We have guys who are kind of wary of shooting each other at both sides, so it's kind of scattered numbers. But with Bunker Hill, it's kind of just the culmination of these 2 months between Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill that we see by factual evidence the bloodiest day of the entire American Revolution.
yeah. Well, it's interesting because Lexington and Concord, there was precedent for kind of. There were other times this could have happened. You have one of the Portsmouth alarm up in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. You have Leslie's retreat in Salem, Massachusetts. That they didn't break out into war, but they absolutely could have. As
Yeah.
opposed to Bunker Hill, where it seems like wars started at that point. So,
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a portion of people now by the time Bunker Hill comes, especially in Massachusetts, and for the likes of Warren, that separation from England has to happen.
right.
And they hope, and Warren wrote months before this in November of '74 that this shouldn't the separation shouldn't come at the expense of blood and treasures by either side. This should become between policy and reconciliation, etc. And it never comes, as we know. So yes, the Leslie alarm in February '75, the powder alarm happens even in September '74. So there's quite a few moments leading into this, and then of course Lexington and Concord, Grape Island. We talked about Chelsea Creek the last time I talked with you. So this battle is really just a culmination of not only just the two previous months, but realistically speaking, we have kind of the Boston Massacre speaking here. We have the Stamp Act riots. There is a lot of tension and frustration and just aggravation, really, to the point of just hostility where these people don't want to deal with this government anymore that just seems to never sympathize with them across the Atlantic Ocean.
Right.
And they wanted to self govern above all things. And unfortunately, Parliament and King George III's ministry weren't having it. So yeah, so on June 17th, here we are. Everyone wakes up. This huge fortification is thrown up there. Warren is finally alerted of it. He springs into action right away, apparently, and rides right to the room of General Artemis Ward and the others. Um, Many of them pleaded for him not to go. They knew basically by already at this point, as he's learned, the British have started firing from the ships. So they are already under cannon fire at the redoubt. It's a very dangerous situation, and people are not wanting the president of a colony to go and potentially die. Because the last time that Warren was engaged in hand-to-hand combat at Lexington and Concord, he came close.
Right.
He had a near brush with death at the plains of West Cambridge. Apparently, the musket ball hit the earlock of his wig, and then after that, everyone just thought this guy was basically anointed by providence by God to lead them, because that's the whole appeal to heaven type of idea is going
Right.
on at this point, and the very last appeal. So you have this young, brave, eloquent guy who's volunteered himself at every battle so far. He's been at the head of race and behind in a lot of situations, like the Tea Party, behind almost every single major event in colonial America for the last decade.
Right.
And so apparently, both sides now are kind of at a stalemate by afternoon of the June 17th. The cannons are still firing from the ships, but the soldiers and Marines haven't been engaged on the ground yet to march up to Breeds Hill.
Yeah.
And right before, I guess, this happens, a lone horseman is seen riding up across the peninsula, and it's Dr. Joseph Warren.
Right. So he rides in from Watertown.
From Cambridge. Watertown is basically the site of the provincial congress, and that's basically separated from the army camp and the council of war that's been formed in Cambridge. So it just made a lot of sense for Warren at this point to be closer to the army. So a lot of the powers of the provincial congress is actually given to this council of war / committee of safety, because they just can't have Warren riding on horseback back and forth every day.
Right.
It just doesn't make a lot of sense. So he came straight from Cambridge, basically, looking at Artemis Ward and Elbridge Gerry and all these people who are pleading with him not to go, like, why aren't you riding with me? And he basically doesn't wait and waste any more time, and he arrives at the battle.
Interesting. So we have Dr. Warren at the battle. The fortification has been built. Can I ask you, what do you know about the reasons the battle takes place? By which I mean, I know the Patriots have built this fortification. Were the British already planning on taking the hill, or do they see the fortification and decide, hey, we can't let this happen?
Well, it's a little of both. Like I said, these hills were in discussion for a long while. Right after Lexington and Concord, for at least these whole 60 days, all of these hills, Dorchester Heights, which eventually becomes the site of Washington, firing cannon and taking back Boston the following March. All of them are positional conversations, if you will, in terms of what can we do to gain control of peninsulas. Because again, there's a provision war going on where the British control the ports, yet the colonists have the entire countryside and agriculture and livestock. So the British want to capture that as much as they can. So if they take Charlestown, then now they have the two big peninsulas that are facing all of the port, the basically the ocean, which it makes it easy for them to dock. And then following that, then maybe possibly then they can march their way to Cambridge and just continually make their way through the countryside. So Bunker Hill happens basically, yes, because Charlestown and Bunker Hill and Breeds Hill are talked about a lot. And also, again, these Americans thought throwing up this fort was enough to tell these guys that they were ready to fight. Maybe we should talk about this. And instead, the British said, well, I guess they want war.
Yeah.
And they start firing cannons at them.
You want to fight? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
The most
okay.
powerful military in the history of the world. Oh, okay.
Right. And you have no ship. And that and that arrogance leads into the battle. Warren forms up with the rest of the men at the redoubt. From my research, I think Warren was kind of with his own, I would say, clan of friends and people he had known for a very long time, and basically had his own little squadron amongst the redoubt, along with Prescott's men. You have Israel Putnam's men on the east side of Charlestown on the rail fence there, and then you have Colonel John Stark on the other side with his New Hampshire troops guarding against the flank of the British. But Warren's basically there with the likes of Colonel James Swan, which I don't know if you've talked about him at all. I love bringing him up. So Colonel James Swan was a Freemason, a son of liberty, a Freemason along with Warren at the same lodge. He was also behind the Tea Party happenings. He's a confirmed participant in the Tea Party itself, which Warren isn't. And Colonel James Swan goes on to achieve much greater things after the American Revolution as well. So we won't get into him too much, but another principal player in all this. Colonel Thomas Gardner, another guy who proves his worth, to these Bostonians from Brookline. So you just have a lot of guys, and Massachusetts men who have seen Warren and idolized Warren, guys from the north end of Boston, right where Paul Revere's neighborhood. All of these people are there with him.
So I do want to interject about Swan. I just double checked. James Swan goes on to be very wealthy, and he moves to France, and then France famously, we owe a lot of debt to France financially after the war, and James Swan actually buys the American debt in the 1790s. 20 years after this, he buys the American debt. So now the cost of the Revolutionary War actually gets owed to James Swan, who does a very good job of discharging it, actually pretty fairly. Although I believe he also goes to, again, we're getting off topic, but he goes to prison in France for 20 years because he doesn't want to pay a $30 fine.
Yeah.
Even though he's super rich.
It's a very stubborn just idea, and this is during the French Revolutionary times. They had been throwing people into guillotines, years before that, and they throw James Swan in jail for an extended period of time.
Yeah, I also understand he had once the French Revolution starts going and they start stealing all the royalties things, he buys it and resells it in America, and a lot of the French revolutionaries really like him because he's giving them money to fight the French Revolution. So again, we got way off topic, but as soon as you said James Swan, I was like, I know that dude.
So this is again, and he's behind, he's with Warren, and he's on documents alongside of him in these other big events before this. He's part of an artillery company. He fights alongside Warren in this battle. James Swan actually gets injured twice. I still haven't confirmed where the injuries happened. I'd love to see how he got injured and then kept on fighting and how long that went on for. But there's a significant number of Warren idolizers, and also I think there's a multiracial kind of unity that's happening with this camp going on at this time too, because we have several volunteers, enslaved and free black men fighting, with these guys at Lexington and Concord. We have the Stockbridge Mohicans community, Mohicans, they're fighting alongside with them at Lexington and Concord and throughout this whole time. And we also have members of the Oneida tribe now who are with the Six Nations. So there's a little bit of, this could be a turning point, and it's possible that Warren is really, with his talks of liberty and fair treatment and equal rights, that people are really buying into this. And it's, and of course, Peter Salem has a big moment in this battle, of course, and he fights on later on the Battle of Saratoga. But in terms of where this battle goes, and why it becomes so bloody, um, Lexington and Concord, for better or for worse, there were a lot of wounded, but at least the day didn't have as many casualties as probably could have had. And that, of course, doesn't discount the men who fought and died. But considering about almost 4,000 men in Massachusetts were engaged, and we had almost 2,000 British troops, and the fact that there are few times that hand-to-hand combat happens, it's less than 100 deaths on each side. Whereas the casualty numbers of Bunker Hill, we have over 450 Americans and just over 1,000 British. So this is quite a clash, and going back to that arrogance of, well, you guys want to fight? Okay, we'll start shooting cannon at you. And now the army's really kind of starting to be taken control by William Howe, who shows up about a few weeks before this. General Gage is slowly kind of losing his, position because, by all accounts, he has not been able to implement the coercive acts. The colonists have not submitted themselves to the rule of the British government. And William Howe is younger, and he's a little bit more eager to take offensives against the Americans. Whereas General Gage has an American wife. He had already said plenty of times he had hoped did not come to this. So there's a little bit of the British Army now kind of giving Howe the go-ahead to lead these guys into battle against the Americans. So Howe believes that he's going to be able to repulse the Americans very quickly. It's no secret that the Americans do not have a lot of gunpowder. They, have built this earthen fort. They don't have Navy ships. There is no possible way that now in a pitched battle, not be able to hide in woods and, assault them via guerrilla warfare. There's no way that these guys can face off against the greatest army in the world, right?
Right, not
He's
with
wrong.
your major general fighting as a private on the front line.
Right, and
What are you guys doing?
And we'll get to that too, because at this point, Howe doesn't know this. Howe does not know that.
Right.
Howe doesn't know that Warren is up there, and he's severely underestimating the fact that Colonel John Stark is a solid veteran of the French and Indian War. Of course, the 7 Years' War. We call it the French and Indian War in North America a lot. But he was second in command of Robert Rogers' Rangers. The Ranger handbook that Robert Rogers wrote is still the same handbook that Army Rangers get today. This is the second in command of that brigade in that war. Then Colonel Israel Putnam, same thing. Colonel Prescott, also a veteran of that same war. So again, drawing on that, what I think we talked about last time, we have veterans, we have trained men. As much as we want to talk about how these guys weren't trained and they were just poor farmers fighting for their country. Yes, there were lots of that. And there were lots of boys. There were lots of young men under the age of 16 fighting. And there's a lot of guys who were still enslaved, fighting and volunteering, or fighting at the behest of their master. So you have a lot of different types of soldiers. And looking at this team of, plainclothes soldiers for William Howe, I don't think he could have ever conceived what actually happened, because then the famous part is that he has a bottle of wine and he makes some exclamation to the other officers with him that they'll have a toast and a drink once they take the peninsula. Well, he actually loses the wine bottle at some point during the fighting, and every single officer he said that to was injured or killed. So it's they keep just sending waves of men They send a first wave of regiments up there to march. We of course have this big moment of don't fire till you see the white of their eyes. It's attributed to Colonel Prescott, although I don't think we still know who said it. But basically, the Americans wait back until they can actually get in good position to basically maim as many men as they can, and they have directions to shoot at the officers in particular. So you have just a decimation of the first wave of British soldiers marching up to this hill. And I think in just a mind of disbelief, William Howe sends another wave. He realizes, though, that snipers have positioned themselves in the town of Charlestown, excuse me, and he basically sends some men to go burn the town. So that's where we start having this town now engulfed in flames. You have warships shooting cannons at this peninsula, thousands of men engaged in hand-to-hand combat. After the fact, William Howe said it was the greatest cinematic display of war he had ever seen. And it's his fault. It's like how were you in such disbelief? You kept sending these men up
Who
there.
was
Uh,
bragging?
yeah, so he sends the second wave and tries to flush out snipers. The Americans basically do the same thing to the second wave. But now that issue of gunpowder happens. The Americans, for weeks, months even, pleaded from the Allied colonies that they needed gunpowder. And this is not an unknown fact by anyone. And basically, everyone kind of just does one of these to them. Um, Warren is writing letters just 3 days before this to other colonies, still pleading for gunpowder. And it's going to be months until they even get the sites built to eventually make their own. So this is very important. I think he knew that this climax was going to come and they might be shorthanded, and they were. And Warren is even noted as running out of gunpowder before the third wave comes. But William Howe basically is done with this. He's sick of seeing these Americans repulse his army. So he goes right up to the remaining, regiments on the beach. He leads them himself, tells them to drop their packs, basically their extra gear, so they can make it up the hill better, and face the Americans and get them off this hill. And I guess there's a huge standoff that happens right before they finally clash. Major John Pitcairn, who was injured in Lexington and Concord, and was in Boston for quite some time before that. He actually apparently arrives at the hill with all of these men, and they're all just facing a line of Americans ready to shoot them. And I think they were kind of fooled by the Americans who stayed at the wall and were throwing rocks at them, and doing, using whatever they can. But we talk about we're talking about war and these elements that are coming. This is a hot Massachusetts day. It is probably 90 plus degrees. Commented blaring sun. Now you have a town on fire not too far distant from you, and that smoke really billowing. And that's where people started to, a lot of these accounts, like Abigail Adams talks about seeing the flames of Charlestown.
Mm-hmm.
This is very horrifying to see that now this British army was willing to burn towns, and do whatever was necessary to make these colonists submit. So you have blinding smoke, dirt probably from these colonists digging up an earthen fortification and killing all the grass around them. So you think about just dry dirt on a hot summer day in June. And they now come up, and through the smoke is a line of muskets. And this last shot is always talked about with Warren too, because people like to tie it to towards the end of the battle that Warren was trying to gather the men for the last shot. But this is really where that kind of happens, because the rest of it is just brutal hand-to-hand combat. But basically, Major John Pitcairn now, also, by the way, accompanied by his son, offers surrender to the Americans, and none other than an enslaved man, Peter Salem, walks straight up to him and shoots him right in the head. And these two sides go at it. In terms of time, The first couple of waves, by what I've read, I think the most accurate timetable you can put on this is about the first 25, 30 minutes is those first two waves of British troops being sent up to the hill to confront the Americans. And you have about maybe 25, 30 minutes of then hand to hand combat, and then waiting moments, British taking prisoners, and of course executing anyone else that they felt needed to be executed.
Excellent. Well, yeah, that was just extremely thorough. It's funny you brought up Abigail Adams twice, and I was just recently read a reflection John Quincy Adams has half a century later about being a boy with his mom, actually watching. I forget the exact quote, but how influential watching the smoke from the hillside was for him.
Yeah. And he refused to attend any celebration of Bunker Hill or any commemoration of it. Um, he was very close to Dr. Warren.
Right.
Um, Dr. Warren has a one of the better medical stories of Warren is actually basically fixing the finger of John Quincy Adams. He has a very terrible accident where one of his fingers basically compound fractures. And in 18th century medicine, it's very gruesome times for medicine still. There's no anesthesia. And,
Mm-hmm.
if you did this, to your fingers, they usually just cut them off. And basically, Warren was able to set young John Quincy Adams's finger, and he was able to make a full recovery. So that's one of the, you
Very
know,
interesting.
during all this crazy political times of late 1774, you have this very light, very heartwarming moment of a guy who was a patriot, was a great orator, and was putting himself on the front lines in a lot of situations. Yet he was able to help his neighbor's son.
Right.
Basically, I mean that the Adamses are very close to the Warrens. In fact, Perez Morton, months after the Battle of Bunker Hill, commented that these two families were seen as one. So, of course, we have to talk about it, Jason. So we're just going to get to it. You have this hand-to-hand combat, and you know, I like to. So, for anyone watching and follows Jason's work as well as mine, I don't like to draw upon a lot of the rose colored narratives that we draw for a lot of these people a lot of the times. This, we talk about Warren there. A lot of comes up that he fought as a volunteer, that apparently he showed up without a musket. Um, I mean, to think that of a guy who showed up fully armed to every single battle so far, and basically had set the requirements of dress and armament for every militiaman and minuteman in the colony months before this. It's very doubtful that he needed a musket or needed to borrow one. And when he arrives to Bunker Hill, to actual Bunker Hill, not Breeds Hill, he actually talks with Israel Putnam first. And the big, kind of legendary quote is that, I wish to be in the most danger, or show me where the most hazard is. The more factual accounts actually is it's almost more sad because of what happens. But Israel Putnam basically knows that they are not going to be able to hold the ground, and they will not be able to hold the peninsula against the numbers they're facing. But Putnam needs somebody else to, man basically the retreat of the colonists from the ground and from the peninsula if they lose it. So Warren's positioning, and even where we have his positioning marked still at the Bunker Hill Monument, basically puts him right at the exit. So it's him and a lot of his friends and a lot of solid soldiers surrounding him and fighting with him and warding off approaching British soldiers who are coming at the colonists as they try to make their retreat to Cambridge. So it's, however we get there, I've read that, Warren is actually injured a couple of times himself. Better accounts show that he may have even had a major shoulder injury, or a possible arm injury, possibly stabbed. He does apparently loses a fingernail. And the fact that we know that Warren possibly, right. So basically, since these accounts actually confirm that Warren lost a fingernail. We've gotten to that, but these final moments somehow always get kind of bottled up and kind of lost, in the grand, I guess, the lore of American, canon.
But how could
And
you even
Warren
confirm
died.
that?
Well,
Like, because doesn't they don't retrieve his body for quite some time.
so where I've found the best information about this battle is when they were laying the cornerstone of the Bunker Hill Monument. Daniel Webster, who was at the head of these committees trying to oversee the Bunker Hill Monument's implementation for several years because it got delayed, they lost funding, and the town at this time is going through a huge restoration age, and they're trying to preserve a lot of these sites that happened during the revolutionary times. And he does several interviews with veterans. Live about I think it's about 100 veterans of the battle who are still alive. And again, we look at that like, how is that possible? Well, again, we have lots of young men under the age of 16 even fighting in this battle. So we have actual contemporary accounts that not only confirm that Warren was possibly injured severely, that he lost a fingernail, even possibly. Of course, we'll probably never know for sure,
Yeah.
but was one of the last men standing and actually even gave final words. So, you know, however we get there, I guess. If you want, you can go in the descriptions and follow me. We'll do deep dives into it,
Yeah.
and and like we'll kind of examine where, because a lot of, unfortunately, that history that we have of these guys and all of the founders really is we found all of these letters and journals and stuff like and artifacts in the early 19th century, and by that point, Warren has been so he dies, everyone. So by the early 19th century, war is dead for a long time.
Right.
And it's 50 years or so goes by. Then you add another 20 something years or after that or so, you get to the end of the Civil War, you're almost at a full century that Warren's been passed on. And even by that point, the perspectives had only focused on Bunker Hill, the Battle of Bunker Hill. About a third of the historical record was kind of really centered on the battle, whereas then we had Richard Frothingham, who basically came to the forefront and was like, "We have letters still. Like, why are we still doing this?" So a lot of like myself, Christian Despina, who wrote Founding Martyr, he based a lot of his work on Frothingham as well, because that's where we have a lot of these words written by Warren and where that actual perspective. And it's, however it happens, how we get there, if he is the last man, he's one of the last men standing. Um, and before his ultimate demise, he is actually offered quarter. Major John Small, who is actually a great friend of Israel Putnam, and before this battle even happens, they actually embraced each other. Well, Major John Small actually led one of the waves. I believe it's the second wave of British soldiers up to the hill, and actually gets shot from his horse. And they're actually about to fire upon them, and Israel Putnam rides up and actually stops them from shooting him. So he's spared during the battle himself. So now we're at this point where the Americans are in retreat. There's, those guys who are willing to fight to the very end and are not leaving, including Warren. Prescott, Colonel Prescott, has already left. He even comments that he saw Warren in a shadow of dust and told him we need to retreat, and then lost him and never saw him again. So there's people interacting with Warren, and there's accounts even from those veterans that we always, as an American history, Prescott and Putnam, like, and General William Heath, who didn't fight in the battle, but is a good friend of Warren. We have the words of these guys that make these, accounts a little bit clearer. But I guess Major John Small sees Warren fighting still, and he offers him quarter. But he basically tells them, if you continue on, you will die here today. And Warren basically rejects his offer, turns right around, and basically walks towards the exit. And apparently is still cutting down people. His sword has been preserved. It's apparently his sword. Again, artifacts always questionable. I do believe it's his sword. There's even Masonic engravings on it. So I mean, it's very Warren aesthetic, if that makes sense.
Sure.
This wasn't a guy of money.
Right.
This he was a very simple yet he would want function over fashion. So this is a very
Right.
it looks like a very functional sword. But
He's
he's
slicing
basically
people down.
and that's basically the comment by these veterans that were interviewed some 50 years later, that Warren was cutting down men, but walking slowly on his way out. And basically says last words, and the last words, the exact quote I believe is, "I am a dead man. Go on, my brave countrymen, and continue to fight for your enslaved country." And he's shot dead. And it's a fatal shot. He dies basically instantly.
Is he shot in the back?
So that's another big question, that is Warren executed? Does this happen while there's still heavy fighting? But like I just told you, we have accounts where he's even delivering last words. So this is kind of a crowd of Americans realizing their president is last man on the island, basically surrounded by British troops, and Warren realizes and looks to them and says farewell. So basically he's executed, but Samuel Foreman, who also wrote a biography on Warren, he did a little bit more of a deep dive on the photos that were able to be preserved of the skull of Warren. From the looks of it, it looks like it actually came from the front and then exited out of the back. So he was possibly even looked in the eyes of the guy who shot him, which I believe was either Lord Dunmore, I believe, who was another British officer, or a servant. I forget if it was him exactly, but
Lord Dunmore. Okay, interesting.
I think it's Lord Dunmore, but it's a British officer or
Yeah.
his servant.
I didn't realize he had been offered quarter. That's news to me.
Yeah. So, I mean, but that comes from Major John Small, and John Small is even asked about it years later. I think you have the painting in your thumbnail. We have the death of General Warren. I don't know if you want to bring that up.
I can pop up the thumbnail real quick if you like.
Yeah.
All right, check it out.
Just take a quick.
It's a little small, but there it is, right in the middle.
Yeah, just ignore my face, and I mean you can.
And my surprised look.
But so we have the painting by John Trimble. This was painted in. I'm sure I'm going to be fact checked on the actual date after this, but I believe it's 1783. It might have been even later than that.
Sure.
But I think it's the 1780s. So this is even several years after the battle. But we have, obviously, you see the wave of British soldiers who have overtaken the peninsula. You have several colonists kind of cornered, kind of showing that they're basically in retreat and lost control. And the right corner is actually William Prescott with a nice feather in his hat. And behind him, touching on our inclusion of, history, I believe that's supposed to be Peter Salem, so-called included, but you can barely see Peter Salem, and unfortunately, of course, as we know, that's unfortunately how enslaved and black people were painted into a lot of these paintings. But, lying on the ground there, sad note, I'm probably going to be sipping some apple juice while I talk about this. But, on the ground there, we have, sorry,
Cheers.
Warren.
I don't have. I have my water. I'll sip it for you. Bye, doctor.
It's all right. Water's good. But we have General Warren there laying on the ground, and Major Small, is the one seen in the painting holding back another bayonet from stabbing him. Major Small basically comments, loose quote, that, if only I could have saved him from that. So Major Small arrives, but after the fact of shooting him and these British soldiers, stripping him, taking his possessions, and bayoneting his dead body. It's quite gruesome what happens to him. In fact, by this point, Warren has taken such a such a monumental role in what's happening and kind of has a sort of mythical presence about him now. He survived a gunshot to the head at Lexington and Concord. He's the president of the Massachusetts colony. He is not only proven that he can fight, but he's willing to fight, and he's a great orator. He's quite eloquent. He's quite convincing in his arguments, and he's not swayed by politics. He's really a man of his own virtue. He's really, his own mind, and even this idea to possibly take Bunker Hill instead of Breed's Hill. Apparently, Colonel Putnam before this is trying to plead with him, like, please fortify Bunker Hill. And Warren's just like, that doesn't seem right. It just for hours, just like, and at one point, I guess he says, you almost convinced me. And eventually they take Breed's Hill instead, and this is the battle we have. But unfortunately, we have the death of this young patriot of the American cause. We've touched in our other talks about logistics and time and messages getting back and forth in days. The following day, there's even still question that Warren's alive, or that he may possibly be alive. There's hope.
Maybe he's taken prisoner.
Maybe he's taken prisoner.
It would have been valuable.
It could, yeah, and exactly, and that's kind of where we see a lot of controversy. In the years after certain people like Henry Dearborn, we have him trying to run for governor of Massachusetts and basically throws Israel Putnam and Warren under the bus. And basically says they were inconsequential to the battle. It was Prescott, etc., and he was nowhere even near the redoubt. But we also have General William Heath, who kind of agreed with him, but only on Putnam. But this was also someone who was close to Warren.
It's funny when I hear about Dearborn, I never actually, I hadn't seen anything about him saying that about Warren. I've only heard it about Prescott.
Yeah, so I mean, but the whole point of his, rebutting the history of Bunker Hill was only, to elevate himself, of course, as we know now.
Well, yeah.
I mean, yeah, of course. But then, others start chiming in. You have a guy like William Heath side with Henry Dearborn, but they were really trying to delegitimize Putnam's legacy at that point too. And subsequently, because Warren dies, it's kind of an easy attack. It's easily thwarted, though. I will say that it's immediately, like, we still see commemorations of Warren years after this.
Well, I understand it backfired for Dearborn.
Oh yeah, I mean,
like,
he
just totally lost the race.
Yeah, like landslide.
Yeah.
Like, no one was a fan of this.
No, it was the worst idea.
Right. Yeah. Like, okay. Yeah. Great job. Yeah. Great job. I mean, so, in the days after this battle, Bill Henry Dearborn. I didn't think we were talking about him, but this obviously
I actually really like Henry Dearborn.
Yeah, I mean, other than that, he seemed to have like a very honorable, solid career. It's this running for governor that he takes this stance at the Battle of Bunker Hill, and it completely backfires, and it's a huge mark on his legacy. But anyway, in the days following, we still have hope Warren's alive. The following morning, even John Hancock is writing Warren, letting him know that George Washington is going to be voted as the general. We have Abigail Adams, though, the same day, writing to John Adams that Dr. Warren is confirmed dead.
Right.
And so
I understand Washington finds out about Warren's death. He leaves Philadelphia to go to Boston, and when he hits New York City is when he finds out Warren has died.
Yeah.
Or, he finds out Bunker Hill happened, I should say.
Yeah. So, that's because, of course, we talked about Washington, I think, privately, that, you gotta love George, despite all of these, questions about, these portions of him that were very rooted in a colonial lifestyle. But really, he didn't have to take this position, and he writes several times that he really doesn't want to do this.
No, he doesn't think he's even qualified.
Right. He didn't think he was worthy of the position. He was honored by it. He would serve, but he was also very weary about, of course, going against the greatest army the
In
world
the
had ever seen at
history
this
of
point.
the world.
uh, and so, and again, this is a guy who is wealthy. A lot of his wealth and fortune relies upon this system under the king, and and the British government. And this is not, this is someone from Virginia. This is not, this is, now we're bringing the southern colonies, presence into this, war effort. And yeah, so Washington gets voted in as general on the 19th. And again, no one knows that this has happened to Warren. And I think at this point, too, we're still waiting on potential namings of generals from Massachusetts, even of who there would be under the Continental Army. So like Warren, like it's no question, probably, and of course we have Warren declines the physician general, post to become the major general. And, you know, of course, we know now Artemus Ward and John Thomas and some other guys were actually named as generals, and some others weren't. And there's quite, because Warren's not on that list. Like, was the major general appointment really valid? But by all accounts, once Washington got there, if he arrives to Cambridge and Warren's alive, these two are side by side, and quite literally, because John Adams writes to Warren on the 19th and tells him of Washington being named general. Tells him also bad news. We can't get you any more gunpowder. Sad face. Uh, Ask New York is basically what he says, which Warren did days before the Battle of Bunker Hill.
And New York was
basically,
pretty much all out.
yes, basically. I mean, they're just non-existent at this point.
Well, New York's
So,
like, wait a minute, didn't Benedict Arnold just invade New York at
well, yes,
Ticonderoga a few weeks ago? Didn't you guys
yeah.
just
So
invade us? Do you want our help now? How dare you?
that thought of, yes, at this time now, these colonies still treat themselves as separate countries.
Right.
And even though Warren had written Alexander McDougall and the New York Patriots, and kind of warned them that, hey, we usually won't do this, but we really need those cannon.
Right.
And there's a little bit of blowback from that.
Well,
So
it's
New
one of the
York's,
reasons Schuyler is ranked so highly among the major generals. Is
yeah,
because they were like, let's put someone from New York in charge of Ticonderoga to
yeah,
cool things down here for a
yeah,
second.
ease it up a little bit.
Yeah.
Can't have this Arnold guy and Ethan Allen and whoever else arguing about who's taking leadership. So Washington actually takes this letter from John Adams and has it with him the entire trip from Philadelphia until he arrives to Boston. So yeah, he arrives in New York first. New York, of course, learns about the details of this battle. I'll actually be posting the clipping of the announcement of the battle that is, I think it's a New York Gazette. But it says at the bottom that Dr. Warren was undoubtedly slain. It seems very simple in that announcement, as almost a footnote. But the fact that this other colony, again, these colonies are treating themselves with separate charters as separate countries under the rule of British government. That's the system we have. So for a New York Gazette and any colony to know who Dr. Warren was, just without even saying his first name, kind of alludes to the height that he had achieved in just a short amount of time. His oration was widely printed throughout the colonies in March, of 1775. Then Lexington and Concord, of course, we know who's at the forefront there of that. And then, of course, everyone heard about the Battle of Chelsea Creek, and him and Putnam were at the leadership front lines of that. So it's just the ultimate rise and just the unfortunate tragedy of not seeing where this life was heading. We don't, we can draw on maybe what avenue he would have taken by looking at say his youngest brother, John Warren, who eventually went on to, form Harvard Medical School, and Massachusetts General Hospital, and became an acclaimed doctor, was a surgeon in Cambridge for the Battle of Bunker Hill, and served a couple years under Washington. William Eustis, who was his medical apprentice, went on to become the Secretary of War for James Madison.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, we know about where Paul Revere and Sam Adams and John Hancock and all these other men went. So we can look at these careers and see like this is a guy who could potentially not only just be maybe have become Massachusetts' first governor, maybe even a president of the Continental Congress after John Hancock, but even possibly the first president of this country. And
That's a really
it's
bold statement.
and it
But
it seems
it's not
from we
that
know
out of the range of possibility.
from what we know of Washington, maybe he was a little bit more keen on doing it as well.
Yeah.
And that's where you kind of start appreciating George Washington more as these moments, realizing that Washington's carrying a letter to a dead man, and has to arrive in Massachusetts as basically a representative of Virginia, but also this newly named general of this unionized army.
He's supposed to
Um,
replace that dead man.
Supposed to replace this guy who was around for a decade, and not just as a political leader, but as a well respected doctor who treated all races and all classes of people most of the time for free.
Heavily
Uh,
involved in the church and a
heavily
Mason.
and a Freemason. He's the Grand Master of Freemasons in all of continental America at this point. So that George
Oh,
Washington and under the Scottish Rite. So I mean, they're split by
okay.
in terms of like the British Freemasons and the Scottish Rite. So anyone who is under the Scottish Rite of Freemasons, he was ultimately named the Grand Master of all of continental America by the Scottish Rite. So
That I didn't realize.
yeah. Drop it. No.
Yeah, dude. Well, I mean,
No.
Freemasonry then is not what we think of it today. Like that, it
Well, of
was
course not.
a
Yeah, and
gigantic like not gigantic numbers, but so influential in colonial America for in like I said, both politics and church, which were what's the difference at that at that point,
right.
especially in New
I,
England. But
I
like you were
mean, yeah.
saying, you have these New Englanders who have started a war, and suddenly some guy from Virginia shows up, says I'm in charge now, and they're like, all right, George.
Okay, George.
Okay.
But Washington tries to alleviate. He knows that he's facing a very disgruntled and very sorrowed army, I guess is the best word for that. I mean, the Massachusetts really rallied around Warren, and they're making up the majority of the forces right now. So to have any sort of disgruntlement or disunity amongst them is not to the benefit of now Virginia and South Carolina and Georgia. And you have a lot of people relying now on what George Washington is going to do. So he arrives. He has the letter to Warren. He gives it to the provincial Congress later in the day. But one of the first things he does is actually he attends, and after the so-called drawing of the sword under the tree at Cambridge. I mean, I hate that story, by the
May or
way.
may not have happened. Yeah.
I don't think like there's so much going on. There's not even time for that type of ornamental type of celebration of this new general. This is like a guy arriving, like your new manager at your job.
Right.
It's like like, do you have a birthday party under a tree for your new man? No, like that doesn't happen. He has to prove his worth first, and
Right.
you have to see how he's going to work with the rest of your leadership.
And it's hard to
So
think that it's arguable that Washington would have honed uh, his nuance for the symbolic, so to speak.
right.
Like I don't want to say pageantry, but he would later become very good at knowing how to use himself to represent the greater good. But to think he had that on lock when he shows up, mm.
Not at all. And but that that's why after researching Warren, of course, portraying him now and trying to keep his legacy alive, I try to actually spend an extra amount of time explaining this portion of it after the Battle of Bunker Hill, because a lot of times we read nowadays, we go from Battle of Bunker Hill to then like March of 1776 when we take back Boston and get the British out of there finally. And Washington, of course, leads that. But there's a lot of loss, a lot of uncertainty. Washington's arriving here. I mean, at least the first thing he does is actually he attends the funeral of Colonel Thomas Gardner. And again, this is a huge patriot from Brookline. He's seen fighting alongside Warren at this battle. He's wounded mortally. He finally dies the morning that Washington arrives. So his funeral happens, and Washington attends it as a show of respect, and then he gives the letter to the provincial Congress from John Adams to Warren to read aloud in front of the provincial Congress. So there's a lot of attempts to show respect to the fact he's operating in a different colony. Unlike New York, who's taken offense to capturing Fort Ticonderoga, he's really trying to find some sort of organization now. And it's months, now we have smallpox comes around again for this camp and all of the colonies. And, it stays for several years, basically throughout the entire American Revolution, because you have camps of people congregating and disease is spreading. And you look at that epidemic, it's like 75 to 83.
Right, exactly.
So Washington faces a lot, and there's a failed conquest to Canada. There's bringing the cannon all the way from Fort Ticonderoga all the way back to Boston, which of course Henry Knox does miraculously. It's still to see the road to to Boston from there, but Bunker Hill just sets up so much of what we know that I feel like if people really focused on the aftermath of Bunker Hill and really what made Warren what he was on June 17th of that year, to really have that impact to the point where more towns and counties were named after him than Washington at the end of the war. His memory really lingered.
Right. Right at the end of the war, it gets offhand.
Yeah, but of course,
Washington gets a state and a capital. So
right, yeah. Then of course we have the Constitution,
right,
and he, Washington serves as president. So of course he takes a more prominent role in the formation of what we have the United States now, of course. But that early idea of an American independence and equal rights and that type of mindset to make that last appeal is really stemming from what Warren and those other guys like Samuel Adams and James Otis had been preaching for so many years. And Bunker Hill, like, to me, is not just the culmination of Lexington and Concord or what happened for a year in between. It's a decade or more. There's grooming happening from the French Indian War on into Bunker Hill. There's so many different parts, and it's a sad day to talk about, but I love talking about the facts of it because it gets over my own sorrow. Knowing one day I will have to probably stop portraying Warren in some sort of death, reenactment.
Move on to Washington. I suppose. Well, Spencer. Oh, okay. Sorry, my bad. I don't know. That was off the top of my head. Anyway, Spencer, thank you so much for coming. This was a really thorough review of not just the Battle of Bunker Hill, but the build up to it, which, as you said, is very important. So thank you so much for coming back. I'm sure you'll be back real soon to talk about lots more Revolution.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me again, Jason.
My pleasure. Founder fans, again, Spencer Van Herik, Joseph Warren Portrayer, all his good information down in the description below. And I will be back with another Founder for you tomorrow.